know we are incentivizing small business in general. Part of that, if you go back and look at pandemics over history, trends that were happening before get accentuated. And so before the pandemic, only about 5 or 6% of people work from home. Now close to 40 or 50%, the ones that can. And those will continue probably to do so.
Hello, CoronaWatch viewers, and welcome to this special segment with Mr. Aubrey Lane. Would you like to introduce yourself, Mr. Lane?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. I am Aubrey Lane, and I am the Secretary of Finance for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Okay. So thank you. And with Mr. Lane, we're going to be asking about his political ideology, House negotiations, economic policy, and more. And without further ado, let's begin. All right, Mr. Lane, how do you feel about your bipartisanship in the government and your political views on issues?
Yeah, so I have been fortunate that in both the roles I've served in as Secretary of Transportation under Governor McAuliffe and Secretary of Finance under Governor Northam, that bipartisanship has been a positive in that in both those roles, I see my position to be one that lets people have the facts and the consequences of those facts. And fortunately, when it gets to numbers or building roads, construction costs, and those things, that people really want to have the facts. And so obviously I have to represent the governor in his wishes. But for the most part, try to be seen as an honest broker and give both sides of the issue and the consequences of the actions taken by the General Assembly or the governor.
Okay. So do you mind telling us, our viewers, about your journey to how you got in the position that you are?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I never thought I would be in this position. I was in private industry most of my life, in the last 20 some years in real estate as a private developer with my partners. And I was involved in the Commonwealth Transportation Board. Governor Kane had asked me to serve as a citizen on the Transportation Board. And during this time, we ended up, my partner, unfortunately, was 28 years older than I was, and he passed away. So we ended up selling our company, and that freed me up. And I ended up meeting Governor McAuliffe, although I would suggest that I was probably more Republican in my leaning before meeting him. I've been pretty much apolitical, but I would be categorized probably more as a conservative on fiscal issues, probably much more liberal in my social views in the political arena. But ended up working for him as Secretary of Transportation. And then I had known Governor Northam from, we're both from Hampton Roads. I'd known him, and when he became governor, he asked me to stay on as Secretary of Finance, and which is really where my background was. I started as a CPA, and I have a Master's of Business Administration with International Finance. So the finance role was probably more what I did in my professional life, even more so than the transportation role. So I ended up here. I, like I say, was not very political. Never thought I'd be serving in a governor's cabinet. It's been a great honor, and it's a tough job, but try to present the facts and let people make their decisions based on that.
So you said that you were socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and that's a viewpoint we hear a lot. A lot of people don't like that viewpoint. So can you explain exactly what it means more in depth?
Yeah, sure. I guess from a conservative on the fiscal side is just making sure that we live within the financial means. In the state of Virginia, we have to have a balanced budget. Now, where those monies are spent could be much debate, and that's where I get into sort of the social views. I mean, I obviously believe in diversity and everybody having an equal footing and helping those that most need our help. I actually think that's what a government should do. But unfortunately, unlike the federal government, we can't print money. So we have to have a balanced budget. And then we have to protect ourselves in times like we've gone through the last year, having some reserves so that we don't have to cut those services to the individuals that need it the most when things turn down. And so making sure we have ample reserves and in that. So that's how I would shape my views. I'm almost, I guess, pretty much libertarian in my social views. I think people should be able to live their lives without interference, as long as they're not living, hurting anyone else in that regard. So, not sure if it's popular or not, but I actually believe in letting people live their lives and giving them the most opportunities they can.
All right. So for our next question, we have: do you support raising the minimum wage? And if so, what are the economic impacts of that happening? And if not, why not? And will Virginia see some sort of increase in the next 5 years?
Well, I answer the last part first. I think they will, because I think that's where the politics are trending. In terms of the minimum wage, that is a contract between the businesses and the employees. And I think it's in their best interest to get the best employees, and employees ought to do well if the company does well. And so in terms of a minimum wage, I guess from my perspective, it would depend on what the company is in that regard. But I certainly believe that people should have the opportunity to have a livable wage. I think the wage in Virginia now is low. I don't know what it should go to be honest with you, I guess, depending on the industry. But as important to that is to also have benefits associated with that wage, where people can have health care. And so that would go into computation for me. If that included benefits, then that may indicate what the average salary should be in that regard. But certainly, I think most industries, at least the ones I was involved with, you ought to get the best employees and take care of those employees, and that means paying them a good wage.
So what do you define as a good wage? Like, is it something that's livable, or something that's like, what do you define as a good wage?
Well, I mean, it obviously depends on the position that you're looking at in that regard, but one that is commensurate with that, the ability of that person, and that ability for that person to provide for themselves based on the chosen profession or the job that they're in. We know certainly some jobs that are for instance, those that are more labor intensive, probably not going to pay as much as some other jobs. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't pay well in that regard. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about, if you look at what's going on in business, this trend toward automation, and there's a lot of people being left out that service those people. Right now, we're dealing with restaurant workers that are unemployed and need to be taken care of until their jobs come back. But I believe that they ought to be able to support themselves with the wage that they're earning. And I don't want to give a specific because it depends on the job. But I would suggest to you the minimum wage in Virginia is too low. I just don't know what it should be based on the type of job it is.
So we know that the federal government is trying to do the minimum wage, and that seems to be a lot of pushback against it. A lot of people are saying that we should be enforcing minimum wages on the counties, the localities, the cities in those states. Do you, what do you see like in that regard? Do you believe in that, or do you believe in like the federal minimum wage or a federal floor?
Yeah, actually, I believe the more the states can do, the better off, because of making sure that every state is not the same. And again, it depends on what other things are going on in that state. For instance, now we have Medicaid expansion, which we've have that pool. And so that may factor into how we would compare ourselves with, let's say, New York or California in that regard. On the other hand, to me, it's more of the total package of what type of benefits are being offered, as I mentioned before, and the amount of the actual wage being offered in that. I go back to, it's in the business's best interest to do this. It is, if you're not going to have employees that are competent and are paid well, I don't see how you can stay in business in that. So I can't say I'm against a national or a federal wage limit. Although I generally believe the states in things in that regard, since they're not all the same, are better left to making those decisions.
Okay, so if you have that same logic of like, for each different place, it's up to them. So would you be also in support of like each business creating their own minimum wage?
I don't know about each business. Maybe each types of businesses, there ought to be maybe some look at that in that regard. And I don't want to come across as saying that I've said this a couple of times. I think the wages are too low. I think it's in the business's interest to raise wages and pay their employees. I just don't want to be dictating exactly what that is, unless understanding what other things they're doing with the employees. There are a lot of my daughter happens to work less than 40 hours a week, but she has very good benefits. So she weighs the benefits she's getting versus the salary. And when you look at that together, she's very comfortable with what she's getting paid. That may not be the case for somebody if the wage was just by itself, may have a different view of that.
So we know that if we raise the floor in one small business or some federal level, then that's really going to raise everybody else's wages as well, right? So we know that if like if the federal or the state raises wages, small businesses are going to have to pay that wage, and then other workers are also going to have to, their wages will also have to go up, right? So is it pretty much undeniable that we're going to see job loss? But we're also going to, or it's almost undeniable that we're going to see job loss, or we're also going to see less poverty. So do you think that one outweighs the other, or is there like some sort of like
well,
special?
I don't necessarily buy we're going to see job loss, quite frankly. I do think it will help with poverty, but I think businesses, again, have to go back and be realistic about, I don't know how we can call somebody an essential worker and then not pay them. We've seen that during this pandemic. A lot of the essential workers, we want to call them that, but then we don't seem to pay them. They're only essential when we need them. And of course, I would suggest we need them all the time. So I don't necessarily agree that there'll be job loss. Now, that may happen at a certain company potentially, but I do think that I'll take the state of Virginia. If wages raise, obviously people pay more in terms of taxes, gives us the ability to service more things to help the public. So I don't buy it overall that they'll lose jobs. Well, some companies choose to do that potentially. But on the other hand, again, we want more people employed. And I think companies in their best interest will be able to look at, so what I need to get the pay I need to pay to get the employees that I need for me to be successful. I'll just point this out. When I was in business, we were very made sure that if we did well, our employees did well. And of course, I didn't work for large companies. These were the real estate companies in that. And I just felt that some of these public companies, if you look at the difference between what the CEOs make and what the workers make, doesn't make a lot of sense. It's the CEOs, I think, make way too much as compared to their employees. And I think that is something that we need to look at. It gets back to the inequality going on. And again, I don't see how any company can be successful without making sure they're taking care of their employees.
Okay, so to sum up your position, you believe that in like a state mandated minimum wage. So for example, Virginia's minimum wage is $7.25. So you believe in like a state mandated minimum wage for like each particular business type instead of a floor for everybody, right?
Well, we've looked at, it looks like the state is going to have the minimum wage going up because there's legislation moving up in that regard. Where that ceiling is, I don't know. But yes, I do believe that wages ought to increase, the minimum wage in the Commonwealth. And I do think it should vary depending on the industry. But
So
I don't
when
know
you
that
say
the state will
something
do that. Yeah.
oh, sorry, what'd you say?
I don't know that the state will end up doing that, but I do think that it should not be so high that it keeps certain industries from hiring individuals.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm next thing I'm gonna be asking you about like automation and how that plays into like the minimum wage. So do you agree that like states like Virginia have to start fighting back a little bit against automation because we will see job loss in it? And if so, why not?
I'm not sure they need to fight back. I think the key to that is re-educating the workforce to be able to take advantage of the jobs of the future. I mean, it's one of the things where Governor Northam this year with the G3 program, or free college, community college, if you give back some, that's the key. Is that I'm a believer in lifelong learning and retraining ourselves. And that's where we need to invest in. If these jobs are going away, then we need to help those workers be retrained and invest in that. And I actually think that's, I think the good companies around the country are doing that, helping retrain their employees as they look through automation. But I don't think we should stun automation. We should help the employee get retrained.
Right. So re-education has been a big thing. Things like learn to code, which is basically saying to like, so again, the average like American job is like being a truck driver. And like, do you think it's reasonable to say to these people, we're gonna now teach you how to code, which is like a complex topic, in like 10, 20 years? Or like, what is the time frame on this? And
No,
is
I
it
mean,
reasonable?
there are other jobs, all the jobs that are not going away. For instance, we do at our community colleges today. We retrain workers from their truck drive, although right now I don't think truck drivers are going away anytime soon, quite frankly, in that regard. We need more of them. In fact, I saw a sign on the truck the other day, $2,500 a week for experienced drivers. So that's one area where I know we need more workers in that regard. So no, I don't necessarily, again, think that automation is a bad thing, and I don't think that it necessarily means 20 years to retrain somebody. But I do think there are other jobs that they could be used, and I think it, quite frankly, it's part of the company's responsibility to help them find those jobs within the company or outside.
So we know. So you mentioned re-education. Certain people have mentioned bringing back manufacturing jobs from overseas. So we know that countries move overseas because it's cheaper over there, and we've tried to bring it back. So some of the ways that we've tried to bring them back is through tariffs on China and other places. Do you believe that this actually worked? Is this like an actual solution? Is it viable?
I don't know if tariffs have worked because I think that's caused to put some people out of business because of tariffs. However, yeah, in terms of bringing manufacturing back, I think that is something we should look at. If this pandemic has taught us anything, the supply chain, if we don't control a lot of it in this country, it's going to cause disruptions in the services and goods that are provided to people in that regard. So I do think it can work. The state has a role to play in that and helping bring these companies back as the federal government, but in terms of economic incentives and jobs in that regard. So I don't know that it's worked totally yet, but of course it's just been, I guess, an emphasis the last couple of years, although I know in the state of Virginia, it is a big emphasis, but I don't know that tariffs is going to be the way to get it back. I think, again, is to have the best workforce trained, give the opportunities for people. I mean, I don't buy labor is totally that less expensive around the world because sometimes you get what you pay for. So I used to be in the retail business where shoes were made in different places in the world, but the quality sometimes suffered too. So I think it's a trade-off. It should be a value proposition, but I do think we should manufacture more things in this country than we do.
Okay, so if we do hypothetically manufacture it here, the reason why most companies do outsource to other like countries is because sometimes it's because they have less stringent like workers laws. Sometimes it's because it's cheaper to work there, cheaper to get like company goods there. So if we do bring it here, can we expect like a drastic increase in prices?
Well, there's some other things that besides labor, obviously that's what's cited a lot, but tax policy helps drive a lot of those decisions. in terms of how companies are actually taxed. And so I think you have to look at the whole profitability. Labor is a part if it's a labor intensive, but capital itself, the cost of its capital, and in terms of deploying what is needed to support the manufacturing process, if we're talking about manufacturing in that regard. So there's a whole lot of policies that go into determining not just the labor, although that can be a big part of it. But as I say, automation, that may become less and less a part of it. And these other factors may influence whether or not. I will tell you, when we looked at Amazon, bringing them to the Commonwealth of Virginia, they had two main factors that they were looking at. One was the quality of the workforce, education in the workforce. They wanted us to invest in education. And two, the quality of life, how their workers were going to get to and from their job, investing in transportation. So I think that is as much important to these companies coming here as potentially the cost of labor. It's the net cost of them doing business and the quality of life for their employees.
So moving on from the minimum wage argument. So recently the $1.9 trillion stimulus package was signed. We've all heard about it, and it's a ton of money. So the state itself got $338 billion, if I'm not mistaken. What would you want to spend that money on that we got?
Okay, well, it's a little bit more than that. In the recent the 1.9 trillion that just was recently signed by President Biden, it looks like we're going to get almost $3.8 billion directly to the state and another $3 billion to the localities. So it's a great deal of money. Let's start back with the position Virginia's in. We have been fortunate, not that there haven't been a lot of people that have lost their jobs, and particularly in the lodging, hospitality, and in the restaurant businesses, there are still people unemployed. Fortunately, the government has stepped in and offered unemployment insurance and direct payments to individuals. But overall, Virginia has weathered this pretty well because of our tech industry, our reliance on the jobs in Washington, D.C., the shipyards in Hampton Roads have remained open. So our economy has been a little bit less hit than some others. And our state revenues have held up. Therefore, two purposes that I would advocate for in these monies. One is continuing to help those people who were hurt the most that need to get back on their feet, whether that's business or individuals. And that's those industries I just talked about, and getting those workers back to where they're able to work. The second is, though, that's a lot of money. And our state budget each year on the general fund is about $25 billion. So that's that's 10, 12, 15% of our general fund. I think it ought to be transformational, meaning that I hope we could use it. Like, for instance, we know we have many localities with crumbling schools. Why wouldn't we use some of that to help build, particularly in disadvantaged areas, help put schools, repair schools, or increase the quality of life in those neighborhoods? Because we don't seem to be able to find those dollars other places. And we don't need these dollars to maintain state government because our economy is held up. So that's one of the things that I would look at is there a transformational thing that we won't get to, whether that's school funding for construction or repairs of these schools? That's what we ought to use this money for. Not that it wouldn't be helpful to be used in other programs, but the chances of us seeing this happen again in our lifetime, maybe yours, but not mine, I'm a lot older. It seems to me we ought to use this for a transformational project and really move the needle to help people. And I think one of the areas that comes to mind would be, our K through 12 schools. There are many parts of the state where schools, the localities can't have the funds to fix them up. It's not fair to those students, and why shouldn't we do that? Now, I have not seen, we should say one thing, we have not seen the actual parameters of how to use these monies. But government services like education in disadvantaged areas seems to me an area where they would qualify. There may be other transformational uses, but those would be the type of things I think we should look at, because I think we should view this as a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Okay, so on that same note, you said like we want to allocate this money towards like furthering the social causes, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Helping those most impacted, and particularly those disadvantaged areas around our state. Absolutely.
Hmm. And so saying that we have like this bulk sum of money, how do you feel about using some of it on student loan debt forgiveness?
Well, couple things in that regard. One, I'm not sure there's some restrictions, and I know we can't use it to pay down pension obligations. We can't use it to reduce taxes. I don't know specifically about student debt, but assuming, I just to let you know, I don't know that we could use that. Student debt to me depends. I'll take it for my example. There are a lot of parents that have worked 2 jobs and 3 jobs to make sure their children got into the school, and therefore, sacrificed and paid off that. So I counter that against, those individuals who have this student debt, that may have, is that fair to everybody that we pay off some of it? I'm not suggesting we shouldn't, but I do think there's an equation we need to look at. Should it be wholesale? Should it be for particular areas? Should it be for those students that don't have the opportunity to pay it back? So I'm not against using some of this in that regard. I just don't know about student debt. Just don't know the parameters, but I do know I hear a lot from individuals, parents, and others who have worked hard, paid their way through school, and have sacrificed to do that, didn't borrow the money, but gave up other things. So I think we need to keep that in the equation. So I don't know how to answer that specifically. And I'm not dogmatic about we should or we shouldn't, but I think it's something we need to look at and make sure we understand how we're treating all students. I do believe, I'll tell you what, for instance, those students that are disadvantaged, helping them get a college education. In that regard. So whether that's paying off student debt or whether that's giving them grants up front to help them, not sure, but I don't know that I could say for sure we should just take a blanket policy and pay off student debt.
Okay, so you're basically saying like more need-based student loan debt forgiveness rather than like a blanket student loan gone type thing?
Yeah, I think so. Just like we do current student-based need. For instance, those individuals, whether it's through financial assistance or tuition assistance, that we look at those schools. I would say that would be a good place to start in looking at how we could help those students that most need help.
All right. So, in helping these kids that want to get into these schools, we've read some articles that have kind of pointed to the fact that in most schools, if you do apply for some sort of financial need, it sometimes goes against your chances of getting into that school. So, are there any plans by Virginia to make these like college educations cheaper in some way?
Well, I don't. The answer is yes. There was in this current budget, there was a tuition assistance plan. A great deal of our educational budget goes to that, and it was increased during this last budget cycle. Of course, we can only directly control the public institutions, the 13 four-year colleges, of course, the community colleges. Obviously, we don't control the private schools. I'm not aware of any of the public schools where that is seen as where that is seen if you ask for financial aid. In fact, what I have seen is quite the opposite. In an effort to help and to get diversity and on the campuses, our schools have asked for more aid to help students in that nature. So I have not seen. Now, I'm sure there are those parents who think that some students that are getting a better deal than others. Well, that's a value judgment. I won't get into that, but I don't think our schools that I'm aware of any of them see it as a issue or a negative if a student needs financial assistance. I think more so it's the opportunity and the other qualities of that student that should get them in or not into an institution.
So moving on from that, so you mentioned multiple times Virginia's economy has done well, and that's true. Virginia's economy has done relatively well compared to other places, and are like when you're looking at the revenue and these things, it's not necessarily an indication of how poor people's or small businesses did, right? So large corporations and the tech industry really kept up our economy very well, and these people working from home and whatever. But like again, the small businesses, a lot of them were run out pretty much totally. So is this almost like a double-edged sword, or like because our economy, I think almost even maybe even grew, or our revenue grew. So it's just like a double-edged sword. What would we rather see instead of this?
Well, you are correct. Our economy has grown, and it's because of those industries you talked about. However, we hadn't talked about all the financial assistance that came both from the federal government and the state. If you look at the two financial packages so far that Virginia received, about $12 billion came to Virginia that we pumped back out in to help those individuals and businesses through Rebuild Virginia grants and other things. Of course, the federal government made direct payments in addition to unemployment to those. And so fortunately, there has been some lifeline for those individuals that were most impacted in those industries. And primarily, it was in the lower paying wage industries of hospitality and restaurants in there. And so those are the jobs that were impacted and haven't come back. That's where we need to put the continued dollars to help them get back on their feet. The best thing we can do is get those businesses back open so that the employees do have a job. I'll tell you another place we need is childcare. We need to put more money into helping childcare so individuals can work and feel that their children are safe. I know that's a part of the next stimulus package, part of this one, but also the infrastructure package will have a big part about childcare in that too. So it's not a double-edged sword. It's a sword that at least helped us keep government open, and we haven't had to reduce services, but that doesn't mean we've done enough for those individuals that have been impacted. And I shouldn't say I know because the General Assembly makes the final decision, but we do anticipate putting more in those grant programs to help those individuals that were most impacted. So I'm not sad that our economy held up, because otherwise we would have had to cut services. But I'm not also suggesting to you, you're exactly right. Just because our revenues held up, that doesn't mean everybody did well. Quite the contrary. There are still people that need a lot of help.
Absolutely. And so on that same topic of like small businesses and big businesses, we've read a lot of studies recently that are saying like that these big corporations are starting to be like, they want to be in distance type work situations more than they want to be in physical type work situations. But again, that does kind of go against small businesses, because mainly the big corporations are the ones that are even have the means to like hire more people that way and can like sustain their businesses in distance. But that small mom and pop shop can't really do that. So is Virginia doing anything to incentivize like in-person work or incentivize small business growth post-COVID?
I'm not aware of any work in the business place. I know we are incentivizing small business in general. Part of that, if you go back and look at pandemics over history, trends that were happening before get accentuated. And so before the pandemic, only about 5 or 6% of people work from home. Now close to 40 or 50%, the ones that can. And those will continue probably to do so in that. Now, if you're in a restaurant or if you're in a landscaping business, you can't work from home. That's not where your position is. And those are the ones we've got to continue to help and get back on their feet in terms of helping them. So I know there's incentives in that. I mentioned the Rebuild Virginia, in addition to all the federal programs that are coming in. And I certainly expect the General Assembly to allocate some of these dollars to that. But some of the trends are going to continue. For instance, retail. We now know that many people are going to continue to buy goods online. They're not going to go into retail shops. They found out how easy it is to do so. Part of that is because of the pandemic. Part of that is just a trend that got accentuated, that we were moving that way to begin with. So that gets back to re-education and helping those people during that time until they get that job and re-education, so that they can, find a job in the next, whatever's coming next. And that's just part of, I think, the business cycle here. And it got accentuated because of the pandemic.
So earlier when you were talking to Pranav, you talked about, childcare and how we can help those people get back into work, correct?
Yes, I think we need to do that.
Mm-hmm. So is that like a universal childcare type program? Like everybody can have some sort of like publicly mandated childcare?
We can do it through several different ways. It could be through payments or grants. It could be through tax policy by giving a child care credit, a refundable child care credit, where in other words, you get the monies even if you don't have that much taxes coming in, depending on your need and what your financial status is. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. The main thing is right now, a lot of those places are actually closed. We need to get them open so parents can actually go there, and then we need to help them get it paid in that regard. Again, that's got accentuated by the pandemic, but that was an issue well before the pandemic too. Many working families were finding it hard to pay for childcare and were forced to have a parent stay at home because they just couldn't afford to pay childcare. And that needs to be fixed if we're going to have a society, not only in terms of the inequality in terms of pay, but also a society that's moving forward and we can have the people ready to take the jobs that are coming in the future.
So moving on to, or going back, I guess, to the stimulus bill. So we know that this is like almost one of the first times, I think, during COVID that we've gotten this much money from a stimulus. So number one, I don't know, should we have even more than this? And number two, do you wish that we had gotten this maybe earlier in the time frame? And how much would this have helped if we actually got it, in June, July, or March, whatever?
So it would have been better had we had the money earlier, simply from the standpoint of being able to do more with it more quickly and addressing, because remember, we shut everything down to start with. And so that's where we had the most impact to employees or individuals, because everything was shut down by the order of the governor because of the pandemic in that. However, I don't know where we are now. Certainly, we're not going to turn down money, but much of the money was not at our discretion. A lot of it went directly into programs that were dictated by the federal government that were needed. Don't get me wrong, education, public health, buying protective equipment, helping the frontline workers, vaccinations, testing, contact tracing. So a lot of it had to be spent in particular areas. The areas and this new package that we're getting, it looks like we're going to have a lot of money that is at more discretion that the General Assembly can use in various areas. That's where I got to this transformational issue in that. But I don't mean to say that it to be instead of helping those people that need the most help. We've got to do that and making sure that they are taken, held over and until we can get the economy back open, they can return to their jobs, or if they don't have a job, helping them get retrained to get a job in that. So where we stand now, it probably would have been better to have the money earlier. Although our economy held up, we may not have had we might have been able to start some of these payments earlier had we known that this money was coming. And so, fortunately, we weathered it pretty well, at least in terms of not having to cut services. So this money is now available, and as you know, it can be spent over 4 years now. This money can be spent through 2024. So a big question will be, do we how do we use it most wisely, and the time frame that we use it in. So not complaining that we got it now. Would have probably been helpful. We got it earlier. Would have given more surety to do some things because we knew the monies were there. But that sort of watered over the dam. And as I said, we're in pretty good shape, and so we should be able to put this money to good use.
So in a recent meeting, I believe you mentioned that the expenditure costs of COVID can be balanced out by new revenues from marijuana legalization and other things. So we know that Virginia very recently legalized marijuana as one of the first states to do so for like adult use. What can we expect to see on the economy with regards to marijuana usage, marijuana legalization, and decriminalization?
Well, from an economic standpoint, it's going to take a while for the monies to flow. It's more from our perspective, I think, an equity issue because of the penalties associated with it, particularly in the minority communities in that. So that should start being a benefit right away. In terms of the monies, it's going to take a while for that industry to get set up. In fact, we're actually going to have to help it get set up. Like for right now, if you want to have a marijuana industry, some banks won't even let you open a bank account because federal guidelines, because it's not legal at the federal level yet in that regard. Eventually, though, it should generate. I think there was a audit study done by JLARC, the legislative branch, that said probably as much as $300 to $400 million a year in revenue to the Commonwealth once it gets up and running, and that's 4 or 5 years away. So that could be a very positive. Another issue that we haven't talked about is gaming and sports betting in the Commonwealth. Those monies will probably happen sooner, and in terms of coming in, and so those will be revenues to help support the general fund. Of course, whether General Assembly chooses to spend those, I don't know because they haven't started materialized yet, but that should help us in terms of revenue generation, in terms of education, medical care, and the other basic necessities that are required in our constant, our budget. So I do believe they are going to be helpful, but they are a ways away before we really see the economic benefits of them.
All right. So you mentioned that we would need to get like these newer, more hip industries off the ground, like marijuana legalization and gaming. So do you think that we can decrease expenditure costs through stabilizing the already existing economies that we have? And a follow up on like the small business thing, how are we going to advertise? Like, how are we going to specifically get the word out there? Like, hey, yeah, we've done this, so let's start stimulating the economy this way.
Well, I don't know if it's what we hope that these new revenues help offset some of the losses that may be becoming because of other things that happen in the economy, the transition in the economy. We have traditionally been very dependent on the federal government. Defense spending and other spending really is dependent, and we still are. But it helps every time we move away. Now, we don't want to give up any of that, but move away into other industries, whether it be tech industries or manufacturing we're trying to bring here, or marijuana, or the gaming, what other industries that we're trying to attract to the Commonwealth. The way to get the word out is through, I don't know if you're familiar with, we have what's called the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, VEDP. Their sole job is to help get businesses, particularly and a lot of small businesses, into the Commonwealth and supported. And so that's one area where we can reach out. I happen to sit on the board as the Secretary of Finance, but that's an area that can really help. And in fact, instead of attracting new businesses, their focus the last year, and should be the focus for a while, is helping getting our current businesses back up to speed. So I think that is the way to do it. And look, as I said before, what attracts businesses to the Commonwealth is its quality of life, its education system, and its ability to move its people around. We need to keep investing in those areas.
Okay. And so our final question will be on the topic of, Well, final category of questions will be on the topic
Sure.
of unionization in Virginia. So, what sort of power does Virginia want to give the workers? And specifically, do you support unionization and the democratization of workplaces? And what is the effect of unionization on state economies?
Yeah, well, that's a lot in there. In terms of unionization, um, my my personal opinion is that it shouldn't be necessary if the employer is doing what he should be doing. I'm not suggesting that all employers do that in that regard. So I do not have a problem with for people that have the right to unionize. It ought to be their choice. It shouldn't be mandatory. But if workers do want to have a union, it should be their choice. So I don't think they should do anything to preclude it happening. And I would suggest to you, if a company was really doing what it should be doing and taking care of its employees, it shouldn't be necessary. But that's not the case, and therefore it should be the right of employees to unionize. In terms of state government, of course, there was a law passed that is now going to be the case. I don't have an issue with that, except for the fact of how let's say it's that Commonwealth of Virginia, the General Assembly has to pass the budget. I don't know how we're going to be able to negotiate with the union, and then we got to make sure the General Assembly is going to pass the laws and appropriate the money necessary to do that. So it's not so much against it, it's just how the process is going to work. So we're going to have to work that out with the General Assembly in terms of if, let's say, the state police unionize and there's a negotiation and they get a large pay increase, which is part of the negotiation. It doesn't mean anything unless the General Assembly approves it. And so we got to figure out how we're going to make that all work procedurally wise. But so I don't know how the impact's going to be on the Commonwealth of Virginia. I don't necessarily say it's going to be more costly, or it's going to save us anything. I do believe it is the right of employees, if they don't think they're being treated fairly, to be able to unionize, but it shouldn't be mandatory. It should be their decision to do so.
So you mentioned the House, the Assembly has to pass things in order for like unionization, whatever effects to go into place, right? So that's one option. The other option is almost like democratizing the workplace to a certain extent. Like 20% of workers like some share in the company, and they're allowed to vote on a particular issue. What is your stance on that? It's a little bit more controversial, but what do you think about democratization of the workplaces?
Yeah, I still believe in capitalism, and there ought to be a separation between the government and companies. And it's just my view. If you go back and look, and what all capitalism is, or communism or socialism, is a social ordering of people for their betterment. That's what the theory is. I'm not saying it always works the way it in that regard. There's some things in capitalism I think need to be addressed, like CEO pay being extremely high compared to worker pay in that regard. However, if you go back and look at it, capitalism has fed more people out of poverty than any other social ordering. So I do believe in that separation. It doesn't mean that it can't be fixed, because I also believe that with capitalism, there is an obligation to take care of employees and those in our society less fortunate. And I'm not suggesting that's all being done correctly now, but that's really the way it's supposed to work. So I would have to say, though, I am not for where the government is in there telling businesses what they should do. They should regulate the workplace. Make sure people are safe, but I would not favor the democratization of businesses. Now, there are others that might have a different viewpoint, but from mine, it's because I'm a little older than you guys. I've seen other types of things, and it doesn't necessarily say capitalism is working correctly the way it should now, but it has helped pull a lot more people out of poverty than other social orderings.
All right. So in your belief, What role, if any, does state legislature play in the role of private businesses?
Well, I think from the business standpoint, they should make it an equal playing field. We shouldn't pick winners and losers from the business standpoint. However, from the employee standpoint, there obviously needs to be certain guidelines, and depending on the industry, as to the safety of that individual. We've talked a little bit about minimum wage in that regard, and what they should be in making sure that that individual has not been taken advantage of in that. Again, my view is if a company is doing it right, the employees don't need the state to step in, but I don't think all of them are doing it right as needed. So my view is that the state should allow and give an equal playing field for all businesses, but make sure they're protecting the workers.
So going back to like worker employment. So before COVID, this is more so on the federal level, but before COVID, we almost saw maybe even like a too little unemployment. I think it was around 3.5%, around that, right? So what that means is businesses can't find workers, and it's just going to speed up automation, kind of. So did we solve that with COVID, or is immigration the solution, incentivizing more childbirth, more workers? How do we solve that, or is it already solved?
Well, that is a good point. First of all, I would say the unemployment rate that we see is not the true unemployment rate, because there are some that are not even looking, that have quit looking for work for lots of different reasons. So I don't think it was as low as that. But you are right. Businesses were having hard time getting qualified workers. Part of that goes back to education. I certainly do believe we ought to have an immigration policy, because our birth rates are low in this country. And in fact, I read something other day, and by 2045, I mean, there's going to be more people 85 than there are people under 20. I mean, and so, it's just the way we pay for things like Social Security, that doesn't work without a labor pool. So I do think we have to have a better immigration policy. Particularly, I'll mention in Virginia, we still have out-migration. There's more people moving out of the state than are coming in. A lot of that had to do with one of the reasons we wanted to attract Amazon and the education we poured in there, the education system to keep people who are trained here to stay here. But I don't think that the pandemic solved it. It may, in a strange way, it may help it as long as we're helping those employees get the jobs. It's not going to help if we're not helping those people impacted either through retraining or helping them get the job. And that's what I think that these monies that we're getting from ought to be used for.